She stood trial alone until the widower walked in and said, "She's mine." The dust swirled thick through the courthouse windows, carrying with it the scent of sage and dying summer. Clara Whitmore sat rigid on the wooden bench, her hands folded tight in her lap, the black fabric of her dress absorbing what little light filtered through the grimy glass. The murmur of voices behind her felt like distant thunder, rolling across the small frontier town of Millhaven with the weight of judgment already past. Judge Morrison's gavel had barely quieted the room when the door creaked open, sending a shaft of brilliant sunlight across the worn floorboards. Every head turned, including Clara's, though she immediately wished she hadn't. The man who stepped inside was tall and weathered, his brown hair touched with silver at the temples, his clothes speaking of hard work and honest living. She'd never seen him before, yet something in his steady grey eyes made her breath catch. "Your Honor," the stranger said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about this woman." Judge Morrison peered over his spectacles, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. "And you are?" "Samuel Creek, sir. I run cattle north of here." The man removed his hat, revealing more of that silver-touched hair. "This woman is my wife. We were married by proxy while she was visiting her sick aunt." The courthouse erupted. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, her mind reeling. She'd never married, never even been courted properly, yet here stood this stranger claiming her as his own. Sheriff Dawson shot to his feet, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "Now hold on there, mister," Dawson growled. "This here woman stands accused of horse thieving. She was caught red-handed with Jeremiah Polk's stallion." Samuel Creek's eyes never left Clara's face, and in them she saw something she couldn't quite name. Protection, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit backed into a corner with nowhere to run. "My wife has been visiting her sick aunt in Cedar Falls for the past month," Samuel said calmly. "She borrowed Mr. Polk's horse with his written permission to make the journey quickly due to her aunt's failing health. I have the letter here proving the arrangement." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded paper, yellowed at the edges. Judge Morrison beckoned him forward. Clara watched in stunned silence as this man she'd never met wove a story that could save her life. In the frontier territories, horse theft meant hanging, and she'd been caught with Polk's prized stallion after fleeing her employer's unwanted advances. She'd taken the horse in desperation, knowing full well the consequences, but preferring the risk of the noose to the certainty of what waited for her in that darkened room. The judge examined the letter, his weathered fingers tracing the careful script. Clara held her breath, wondering what magic Samuel Creek had produced, what lie he'd conjured to save a woman he didn't know. "This appears to be in order," Judge Morrison announced, "though I'm curious why you didn't come forward sooner, Mr. Creek." "I only just learned of my wife's arrest," Samuel replied smoothly. "I was driving cattle to the Silver Creek market when word reached me 3 days ago. I rode hard to get here as soon as I could." Sheriff Dawson's scowl deepened. "Jeremiah Polk ain't said nothing about lending out his horse to no woman, and he ain't here to dispute it neither, seeing as how he rode out for Denver yesterday." "Convenient," Judge Morrison muttered, but Clara could see the relief in his eyes. Hanging a woman, even a horse thief, sat poorly with most decent folk. "Mrs. Creek, do you have anything to say about these charges?" Clara's throat felt dry as desert sand. She looked at Samuel Creek, this stranger who'd walked into her nightmare and offered her a lifeline she didn't deserve. His slight nod gave her courage. "I borrowed the horse with Mr. Polk's written permission to reach my dying aunt in Cedar Falls," she said quietly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "My husband speaks the truth." The lie tasted bitter, but not as bitter as the truth would have been. She couldn't tell them about her employer's hands on her, about the promises and threats whispered in the darkness of his study. She couldn't speak of the fear that had driven her to take Polk's fastest horse and ride hard toward any horizon that didn't include Marcus Thornfield's ranch. Judge Morrison banged his gavel. "Case dismissed. Mrs. Creek, you're free to go with your husband." The crowd began to disperse, their disappointed murmurs following Clara as she rose on unsteady legs. Samuel Creek approached her slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal, his hat still in his hands. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible above the scraping of chairs and shuffling of feet. "We should go," he said simply, offering her his arm. "Folks will expect us to leave together." She took his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. They walked from the courthouse into the blazing afternoon sun, past the curious stares and whispered conversations of Millhaven's citizens. A buckboard waited at the hitching post, drawn by two sturdy horses that looked well cared for despite their age. Samuel helped her up onto the wagon seat, his touch gentle but impersonal. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, clicking softly to the horses. They rolled out of town without speaking, the courthouse growing smaller behind them until it was just another building in a town Clara hoped never to see again. The silence stretched between them like the endless prairie, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the soft whisper of wind through the grass. Clara stole glances at her unlikely savior, trying to read the story written in the lines of his face. He was handsome in the weathered way of frontier men, but there was a sadness about him that went deeper than sun-carved wrinkles. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked, when the town was nothing but a smudge on the horizon behind them. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dirt road ahead. "I've been alone too long," he said at last, "and you looked like someone who understood what that feels like." Clara felt something twist in her chest, a recognition that went bone deep. "You don't know anything about me. I know enough." He glanced at her sideways. "I know you didn't steal that horse for money or meanness. I know you were running from something bad enough to risk your neck. And I know you're brave enough to take that risk." The words hung between them, honest and raw in the fading light. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm evening air. "Where are you taking me?" "My ranch. It's about 2 hours north." He paused, then added quietly, "You can stay as long as you need to. No expectations, no obligations beyond what we told the judge." Something in his voice made her look at him more carefully. There was pain there, old and deep, the kind that came from loss rather than cruelty. She'd learned to read men's intentions in their voices, in the set of their shoulders, in the way they looked or didn't look at a woman. Samuel Creek looked at her like she was a person, not a thing to be used or discarded. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted, the confession torn from her against her better judgment. "Then we'll figure it out as we go." The sun was setting by the time they reached Samuel's ranch, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. The house was modest but well built, with a wide porch and windows that caught the last light. A barn stood nearby, along with a small corral, where several horses lifted their heads to watch the approaching wagon. Samuel pulled up beside the porch and set the brake. "It's not much," he said, "but it's peaceful." Clara climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long ride. The air smelled of hay and wood smoke, with an underlying sweetness she couldn't identify. As if reading her thoughts, Samuel nodded toward a small orchard behind the house. "Apple trees," he explained. "My wife planted them when we first settled here." The past tense hit Clara like a physical blow. She looked at him with new understanding, seeing now the source of that deep sadness she'd sensed. "I'm sorry." 3 years now. He unhitched the horses with practiced efficiency. Fever took her in the winter of 71. We weren't blessed with children, so it's just been me and the land since then. Clara stood uncertainly by the porch steps, unsure of her place in this stranger's grief. The evening breeze stirred her skirts and brought with it the lonesome call of a night bird. "Come on inside," Samuel said, leading the horses toward the barn. "There's bread and preserves in the kitchen. Help yourself to whatever you need." The house was clean and simply furnished, with the kind of careful order that spoke of a man living alone, but not giving up on domestic comfort. Clara found herself in a kitchen that still held traces of a woman's touch, hand-sewn curtains at the windows, a collection of clay pots on the windowsill where herbs had once grown. She found the bread wrapped in clean cloth, still soft from the morning's baking. The preserves were apple, sweet and tart on her tongue, and she realized she hadn't eaten since dawn. She was finishing her simple meal when Samuel returned from tending the horses. "There's a room upstairs you can use," he said, lighting a kerosene lamp against the gathering darkness. It was going to be a nursery. There's a bed and a washstand." The words hung heavy with old hopes and might-have-beens. Clara felt like an intruder in this house of quiet sorrows, yet she had nowhere else to go. "Mr. Creek," she began. "Samuel," he corrected gently. "If we're going to keep up this pretense of marriage, we might as well use given names." Samuel. The name felt strange on her tongue. "I want you to know that I'm grateful, more grateful than I can say, but I also want you to know that I can't." She struggled for words that wouldn't sound ungrateful or presumptuous. "Clara," he said, and she realized with a start that she'd never told him her name. He must have heard it in the courthouse. "I told you before, no expectations. You're safe here for as long as you need to be." Something in his tone made her believe him, made her shoulders relax for the first time in months. She nodded and took the lamp he offered, her fingers brushing his briefly. His hands were calloused from honest work, warm and steady. The room upstairs was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the darkening prairie. A quilt covered the narrow bed, its pattern of interlocking rings speaking of patient hands and long winter evenings. Clara set the lamp on the washstand and sat heavily on the bed's edge, the day's events finally catching up with her. She'd woken that morning in a jail cell, certain she would hang before sunset. Now she sat in a stranger's house, wearing a stranger's name, protected by a man who'd married her in the eyes of the law without knowing her story. The weight of it all pressed down on her, and for the first time since her escape, she allowed herself to cry. Outside her window, the night sounds of the prairie began their ancient symphony. Somewhere below, she heard the soft tread of Samuel's boots as he moved through his evening routines. The sounds were comforting in their ordinariness, a reminder that life continued even in the darkest moments. That morning would come again, despite everything. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and bacon frying. Pale dawn light filtered through the curtains, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of yesterday came flooding back, along with the realization that she'd slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in weeks. She dressed quickly in her one spare dress, grateful that she'd managed to grab her small traveling bag before fleeing Thornfield's ranch. When she came downstairs, she found Samuel at the stove, his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly mussed from sleep. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's hot if you want some." Clara poured herself a cup from the pot on the stove, inhaling the rich aroma. "You didn't have to cook for me." "Had to cook for myself anyway." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "Besides, I figured we should talk about what comes next." They ate in companionable silence, the morning light growing stronger through the kitchen windows. Clara found herself studying Samuel's hands as he ate, noting the careful way he handled even simple tasks, the consideration he showed for the food and the dishes, and the quiet morning. "I need to ask you something," he said finally, setting down his coffee cup. "That letter I showed the judge, it wasn't real." Clara's heart skipped, but she kept her voice steady. "I know. I wrote it yesterday while you were in jail. Asked around town until I found someone who knew Polk's handwriting well enough to copy it." He met her eyes directly. "I committed forgery to save you, Clara. I need to know it was worth the risk." The honesty in his voice demanded the same in return. Clara set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap, gathering courage. "I worked as a housekeeper for Marcus Thornfield," she said. "When I received word that my aunt in Cedar Falls was dying, I asked Mr. Polk to lend me his fastest horse so I could reach her in time. He agreed and gave me written permission." She paused, then continued more quietly. "What I didn't tell the court was why I really needed to leave so urgently. Thornfield had been making unwelcome advances. When I refused him, he became threatening. I used my aunt's illness as an excuse to escape before he could force himself on me." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Did he hurt you?" "Not the way you mean. Not yet." Clara's hands trembled slightly. "But he would have. He made that very clear. Then you were right to run." Samuel's voice carried a quiet fury that wasn't directed at her. "And I was right to help you. If this story has touched your heart so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with friends who love Old West stories. Sometimes the most powerful moments come not from grand gestures, but from simple acts of human decency, like Samuel's quiet declaration of protection for a stranger in need. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Clara with its gentle normalcy. Samuel rose before dawn to tend his cattle and horses, and Clara found herself taking over the household tasks that had long been neglected. She mended his shirts and cooked proper meals, tended the struggling herb garden, and swept the dust from corners that had gone too long unnoticed. They spoke little during those first weeks, but their silences were comfortable rather than strained. Samuel had given her space to heal, and Clara had given him the gift of domestic life restored without the pressure of intimacy. They were two wounded souls finding solace in shared routine and mutual respect. It was nearly a month after her rescue when trouble found them. Clara was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple horses, ridden hard. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the lead rider, Marcus Thornfield, his face twisted with the rage she'd tried so desperately to escape. She dropped the wet sheet she'd been hanging and ran for the house, her heart hammering against her ribs. Samuel was mending tack in the barn, too far away to reach in time. She burst through the kitchen door just as Thornfield and two of his men dismounted in the front yard. "Samuel!" she called, her voice cracking with fear. He appeared in the barn doorway, took one look at her face, and started running. But Thornfield was already striding toward the house, his spurs ringing against the wooden porch steps. "Clara Whitmore," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Time to come home." Samuel reached the porch just as Thornfield raised his hand to knock. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. Thornfield turned, his cold eyes taking in Samuel's work clothes and sun-weathered face. "You can hand over my property. That woman belongs to me." "That woman is my wife." Samuel's tone remained calm, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "And this is my land. You're trespassing." "Wife?" Thornfield laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "That little thief couldn't catch a husband if her life depended on it. She's been spreading her legs for board and room, and now she's stolen from me to boot." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Samuel moved. His fist connected with Thornfield's jaw with a sound like an axe biting wood, sending the larger man stumbling backward. "You'll apologize to my wife," Samuel said quietly, "or you'll leave my property. Your choice." Thornfield's men moved forward, their hands moving toward their guns. Clara stepped onto the porch beside Samuel, her chin raised despite her trembling. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she told Thornfield. "I'd rather hang than go back to your ranch." "No, hanging can be arranged," Thornfield snarled, wiping blood from his split lip. "Sheriff's been looking for you, Clara. Seems there's been some question about that letter you produced at your trial." Clara's heart sank. She'd known their borrowed time was running out, but she'd hoped for longer than this. "The letter was genuine," Samuel said. I can produce witnesses who saw Jeremiah Polk give permission for my wife to borrow his horse." "Can you now?" Thornfield's smile was ugly. "Because Polk says different. Says he never saw this woman before in his life, never gave her permission for anything." Samuel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Jeremiah Polk is mistaken." "Is he? Or are you a liar as well as a fool?" Thornfield stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I know what that little whore did, Creek. She seduced you with promises of things she'll never deliver, then spun you some sob story about needing protection. But she belongs to me, and I've come to collect what's mine." This time Clara moved before Samuel could. Her palm cracked across Thornfield's face with enough force to snap his head sideways. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, her voice shaking with fury rather than fear, "and I'd die before I let you touch me again." The silence that followed was deadly. Thornfield's hand moved toward his gun, his face twisted with rage. Samuel stepped slightly in front of Clara, his own hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "You heard the lady," Samuel said. "Time for you to leave." "This isn't over," Thornfield snarled. "That letter won't hold up under real scrutiny. And when it doesn't, your little wife will hang for horse theft, and you'll hang right beside her for aiding a criminal." He and his men mounted their horses and rode away, but their threats hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Clara sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. "He's right about the letter," she said quietly. "It won't hold up if they really investigate." Samuel sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. "Then we'll face that when it comes." "We?" Clara looked at him in surprise. "This is my trouble, Samuel. You've done more than enough." "You're my wife," he said simply. "In the eyes of the law and the eyes of God. That means your troubles are my troubles." The words sent a strange warmth through Clara's chest, a feeling she was afraid to examine too closely. "You married me to save my life, not to ruin your own." "Maybe I married you for selfish reasons too." Samuel's admission was so quiet she almost missed it. "This house has been too quiet too long. You've brought life back to it." Clara studied his profile, seeing the loneliness he tried so hard to hide. "Your wife," she said carefully. "What was she like? Ellen?" A smile touched the corners of Samuel's mouth. "She was sunshine and laughter, could make anyone feel welcome in 5 minutes flat. She saw good in everyone, even when there wasn't much to see. She sounds wonderful." She was, but she was also fragile in ways I didn't understand until it was too late. Samuel's voice grew thoughtful. "You're different, stronger. You've survived things that would have broken Ellen, and you're still fighting." And the comparison should have stung, but instead it felt like recognition. Clara had always been the practical one, the survivor, the one who bent but didn't break. It was both her strength and her burden. "What are we going to do about Thornfield?" she asked. "We're going to live our lives," Samuel said firmly. "We're going to tend this ranch and take care of each other, and we're going to let tomorrow worry about itself." But tomorrow, as it turned out, had other plans. They came at dawn 3 days later. Sheriff Dawson and 2 federal marshals, their badges glinting in the early light. Clara was making breakfast when she saw them through the kitchen window, and her blood turned to water. "Samuel!" she called, but he was already moving, having seen them from the barn. They met in the front yard, Samuel still holding the pitchfork he'd been using to muck stalls. Sheriff Dawson looked uncomfortable, but the marshals were all business. "Samuel Creek," the older marshal said, "you're under arrest for aiding and abetting a known criminal." "And Clara Whitmore," the younger one added, "you're under arrest for horse theft and fraud." "It's Clara Creek," Samuel said quietly, "and I'd like to see your warrants." The marshal produced 2 folded papers. Clara didn't need to read them to know they were legitimate. Thornfield had friends in high places, and he'd used them to make good on his threats. "You have the right to gather personal items," the older marshal said, "but make it quick." Clara went upstairs to pack her few belongings, her hands shaking as she folded her spare dress. From the window, she could see Samuel talking quietly with the marshals, his posture resigned but dignified. He'd known this day would come, just as she had. They both had. She was reaching for her hairbrush when something caught her eye, a small wooden box on the dresser that hadn't been there before. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a simple gold band. "Ellen's wedding ring," Samuel said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come upstairs. "I thought, if we're going to face this together, you should have it." Clara's throat tightened. "Samuel, I can't. This belonged to your wife, and now it belongs to mine." He took the ring from her nerveless fingers and slipped it onto her left hand. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "Whatever happens next, Clara, you're not facing it alone." The words were a promise and a gift, more precious than gold. Clara looked down at the simple band, feeling its weight like an anchor in a storm. "Time's up," the younger marshal called from downstairs. They rode toward Millhaven in a wagon commandeered from Samuel's barn, their hands bound but their spirits unbroken. The marshals rode alongside, professional but not unkind. Sheriff Dawson brought up the rear, his discomfort evident in every line of his body. "I'm sorry about this, Samuel," Dawson said as they neared the town. "Thornfield's got friends in Denver and they're pushing hard for prosecution." "Just doing your job, Sheriff," Samuel replied. "No hard feelings." But Clara could see the wheels turning behind Samuel's calm exterior. He was planning something, preparing for some move she couldn't anticipate. The knowledge gave her courage, even as the courthouse came into view. The trial was a foregone conclusion. Judge Morrison looked haggard as he read the charges, and Clara could see the regret in his eyes. New evidence had been presented, testimony from Jeremiah Polk himself, denying any permission had been given, expert analysis of the forged letter, character witnesses for Thornfield, painting him as an upstanding member of the community. "Do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Judge Morrison asked. Samuel stood, his dignity intact despite the shackles around his wrists. "Your Honor, I'd like to present new evidence." The judge sighed. "Mr. Creek, this court has been more than patient with your fabrications." "Not fabrications, Your Honor, truth." Samuel nodded to someone in the back of the courtroom. "I called Jeremiah Polk to the stand." A murmur ran through the crowd as Polk rose from his seat. He was a small, nervous man with thinning hair and worried eyes. Clara had never seen him before, but something in his expression gave her hope. "Mr. Polk," Samuel said, as the man approached the witness stand, "do you swear to tell the truth about the events in question?" Yes, sir, I do." Polk's voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you give Clara Creek permission to borrow your horse to visit her dying aunt in Cedar Falls?" Polk glanced toward where Thornfield sat, his face growing pale. That is..." "Mr. Polk," Judge Morrison interrupted, "you've already testified that you gave no such permission." "That's not true, Your Honor." Polk's voice grew stronger. "I did give written permission. Mrs. Creek came to me in great distress, said she'd received urgent word that her aunt in Cedar Falls was dying and she needed to reach her quickly. I lent her my fastest horse and wrote a letter of permission because it was the Christian thing to do for a woman in such desperate circumstances." The courthouse erupted. Thornfield shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. "That man is lying! I paid him to..." He stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd just admitted. "You paid him to what, Mr. Thornfield?" Samuel asked quietly. The silence that followed was thunderous. Judge Morrison's gavel couldn't quiet the storm of whispers and accusations that filled the room. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she realized what had happened. Samuel had somehow gotten to Polk, convinced him to tell the truth instead of whatever lie Thornfield had paid for. "Case dismissed," Judge Morrison announced. "All charges dropped. Mr. and Mrs. Creek, you're free to go." The shackles came off, and Clara fell into Samuel's arms, sobbing with relief and gratitude. Around them, the crowd slowly dispersed, but she barely noticed. She was free, truly free, and it was all because of the man who held her. How? She whispered against his chest. Polk's got gambling debts, Samuel murmured. I offered to pay them in exchange for the truth. Turned out he'd been feeling guilty about lying anyway. It was a simple solution to a complex problem, the kind of practical wisdom that came from years of frontier living. Clara pulled back to look at Samuel's face, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. You risked everything for me, she said. Your ranch, your freedom, your life. I risked it for us, he corrected gently. For the life we could build together, if you want it. The question hung between them, honest and hopeful. Clara thought of the empty months ahead, of the choice between loneliness and the terrifying possibility of love. She thought of Ellen's ring on her finger, of the herb garden that needed tending, of the way Samuel's eyes crinkled when he almost smiled. I want it, she said simply. I want all of it. They were married properly 3 days later in the small church at the edge of Millhaven, with Sheriff Dawson serving as witness and the preacher's wife playing piano. Clara wore her best dress with Ellen's ring gleaming on her finger, and Samuel wore his Sunday suit with a wildflower boutonniere that made him look younger and less careworn. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, with vows that meant more because they'd already been tested. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel's kiss was gentle and full of promise, the beginning of something real and lasting. They rode home through the golden afternoon light, the wagon loaded with wedding gifts from townsfolk who'd come to respect their quiet courage. Clara leaned against Samuel's shoulder, watching the familiar landscape roll past, and felt something she'd never experienced before, the deep contentment of being exactly where she belonged. No regrets? Samuel asked as they turned into the ranch road. None, Clara said, and meant it. What about you? Only that it took me so long to find you. He pulled up beside the porch and helped her down from the wagon. Welcome home, Mrs. Creek. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of dreams fulfilled and promises kept. Clara looked at the house that was now truly theirs, at the apple trees Ellen had planted and she would tend, at the wide sky that held all their tomorrows. Thank you, she said, and kissed her husband under the infinite western sky, knowing that some stories end with justice served and love triumphant, that some couples are forged in hardship and tempered by trust, and that sometimes the best marriages begin with a stranger walking into a courtroom and claiming a woman as his own. Years later, when the apple trees had grown tall and the ranch had prospered, when their children played in the yard where Clara had once hung laundry with trembling hands, visitors would ask about their unusual courtship. Samuel and Clara would exchange glances full of shared secrets and hard-won wisdom, and Clara would smile. Sometimes, she'd say, salvation comes in the form of a man who sees you drowning and throws you a lifeline, no questions asked. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that lifeline becomes the foundation for everything beautiful that follows. This story reminds us that our channel's tales are created purely for inspiration and entertainment, not to offend anyone. If these stories of courage, love, and second chances have moved you, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share it with others who appreciate stories of the American frontier. Thank you for watching, and remember that every ending is also a beginning, every rescue a chance for love to take root and flourish.